Welcome to episode 174 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Freeman, and today I have a guest who fascinates me every time I talk about him. He's back the train up. Today I have a guest who fascinates me every time I talk to him. I think I know him a little bit, but each time I talk to him, he's exploring new things, and not only exploring, he's successful in new things, and it's just amazing to me. And I'm excited to learn more from this man, and to invite you to learn from him too. So let me tell you more about him, but nope. But first, this.
Today's guest, Dr. Axel Meierhoefer.
I met Dr. Axel Meierhoefer while I was living in San Diego some years ago. He was enjoying success with a consulting company he founded. Little did I know at the time, Axel was deep at work, intensely researching and identifying the resources he would need to break into the real estate investing world. Today, he's enjoying a fulfilling life in Spain, fueled by passive income and the financial independence that's come as a result of his efforts. Please welcome Dr. Axel to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast.
Hey, Jason, my friend. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here, my friend. Well, you've lived such a expansive life. So when you were 7 years old, where were you living?
We were living in northern Germany, right by the North Sea coast.
In a small town or a big town?
Well, it depends a little bit on how you measure that. About 100,000 people, I guess it would be like a small to medium-sized town.
And if you live in South Dakota, that's a big town. It depends on perspective.
Yeah.
But I have to say it, Sioux Falls is 200,000. Woo! Go
Yeah.
Sioux Falls. So
comparison, that
if
was small.
What?
In comparison, that was small where I grew up.
If I had asked you when you were 7 what you thought you would be doing as an adult, what would you have said?
I would have said I want to become an airline pilot.
What did you enjoy about the idea of flying?
Well, I didn't really know much about it because at the time, I mean, this is a long time ago, and my family wasn't the kind of family who could afford airline tickets. It's not like nowadays where you can get tickets relatively cheap and everybody flies. At the time, flying was like really a luxury. But the fascination came from an uncle of mine who was in an executive role at Lufthansa, and he was working in a high-rise building in Hong Kong to build, at that time, the very early stages of what has become Lufthansa Cargo. Right? I mean, we're all familiar with like normal airline flying, but there is a huge secondary market for cargo, and he was one of the first people to help put that together. But I think part of the fascination was also he had this kind of aura about him, right? Like he was like traveling the world. I mean, and he told stories. Like I give you one little anecdote. In our house, even though at the time smoking was very common, there was a rule that smoking inside the apartment was not allowed. But when my uncle came and he was a pipe smoker, somehow, for some reason, that rule didn't apply. And so for like at least a week or longer afterwards, the place smelled like his pipe smoke, which kind of stayed a little bit in everything. At least to me, it felt like that. So that whole, this guy that is kind of like fascinating, is living a fascinating life, even though he only came for a few hours, stayed for a while, right? And then the other thing is, I think to some extent, my mom has a little bit to do with it, because even when I was still like just barely able to walk, she always pointed to the sky and said, "Look, Uncle Gerd is flying up there," which is obviously not true. But every plane that went by where you saw a contrail, it was supposedly him in the plane.
So as a child, you built up this almost mythical image
Right.
of your uncle, who even after he left, who first of all could smoke in the apartment, and even after he left, his aura through the smoke hung around for weeks. What was that like to you, having a hero like that, having a family member?
Um, well, it was definitely something to aspire towards. I honestly have to say, at the time, I had no concept that you could actually be doing anything other than being a stewardess or a pilot. To me, there were only those two options. You're either in the pilot seat or in the cabin, and nothing else, which didn't apply to him. But he reinforced it in some way, because for people that are a little older, they might remember that the airlines used to have what's called airline paper, which was like super fine paper that you could write letters in while you were flying, and then put them in an envelope, hand it to the stewardess, and they would mail it to wherever it needed to be mailed. Or they had these little wings that the pilots had in like
Oh
plastic
yeah.
or metal, and the little planes. And so every opportunity he had, which it sounds like they were together or we were together all the time, but it was like maybe once a year, he always had one of those little things. So it kind of reinforced the whole thing. And I think some of it had to do at the time, I mean, he's old now, but he was a very charismatic person. Just the way he basically is one of those people where if he came into a room, he kind of commanded attention from everybody, right? The room got quiet and they were like, "Oh, what's he going to say now? What was his latest adventure and stuff?" And I guess that's what triggered it. And that's why the answer to your question, the initial answer was very easy. And I really tried. I mean, it's not that I just had that as a fascination. I actually got pretty close, and then ultimately it didn't quite work out.
What were your parents, or what did your parents do?
My dad was an engineer at Olympia. I mean, I don't know if anybody remembers that, but Olympia
Uh,
was the world market leader for typewriters.
oh, for typewriters.
Yeah, so and they invented, for example, the electric typewriter, and then obviously when computers came along, that all went away. But that was his job in customer service and engineering. And my mom was a secretary at a Navy base, civilian.
So you did pursue, or I've never asked you about this, but you did join the Air Force.
Right. Yes. Well, what happened is you asked me, what would I have answered at 7? So when I ultimately got out of school, I actually applied like in the normal way at Lufthansa to become a pilot. And they said, okay, while your grades and stuff all look good enough, you can go through the training program, which is, or not really training, it was more a testing program. You get physical tests, you had to do all kinds of tests, like in school tests kind of stuff. But then also they had these little simulator things where they wanted to check your hand-eye coordination and your ability to react to kind of unusual situations and stuff. So they took 1 week from Monday through Friday every day to go through these tests. And I was pretty optimistic because I felt I was doing pretty well, that I would actually get in, even though the number of people who normally make it is very, very small. And so I finished the test, and you can't imagine, how much I anticipated. Like sometimes they show this in the movie, right? Like when you're waiting for a letter to come to the mailbox. And so we went out there every day to see if the letter would come. And when ultimately the letter came and said, congratulations, and I didn't really read the rest for a while. It said, congratulations, you passed all the testing required to be selected for airline training. And then the next sentence said, for this year and next year, we're not bringing in new students because the economy is bad. But we will notify you as soon as the training program restarts.
Oh my gosh.
So that's how I ended up in the Air Force. And ultimately first was completely devastated. My mom was very devastated because she knew how much I was kind of aspiring to this. And she told her boss on the Navy base about it. And he said, well, if he wants to fly so desperately and the Lufthansa doesn't want him, why isn't he flying for us? The Navy flies planes too. And so she came back home, said, hey, you can fly for the Navy. Go to this guy. The admiral has already told him that you're coming. I'm like, okay, that sounds good. I went there, said, okay, I heard from the admiral, who is the boss of my mom, that I can fly for the Navy. And the guy says, yeah, that's generally true. But before you can learn to fly for the Navy, you have to learn how to drive a boat. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm here for. I want to fly. I don't want to learn. And especially knowing, having grown up in northern Germany, the water is like horrendously cold and salty and stuff. You don't want to even get anywhere close to that, right? So I said, no, driving boat, not for me. I want to fly. I thought you guys fly. And he says to me, like in this kind of throwaway sentence, well, if you're so desperate to fly, why don't you go to the Air Force? So I'm like, duh. And so I went to the Air Force recruiting office and said, I want to fly. And they said, oh, that's great, but you have to make it through the test. And only 1 out of 2,500 people makes it.
Only
said, well,
1 out. You said 1 out of 2,500?
Yes. And
wow.
So I said, well, that doesn't apply for me. I already made it through the test. And they said, why? What are you talking about? I said, well, I just finished the training at Lufthansa, and here's the letter. They said I passed. They said, well, what the Lufthansa does is completely irrelevant. We only trust our own test. You have to go through it all over again. And so I went through a whole another second week of pretty much the same thing. But in hindsight, I still believe there was a little bit of an advantage, because it wasn't completely new anymore. And it was a little different. Obviously, they put you in centrifuges and high G stuff that no airliner would ever do. But yeah, so I ended up in there for 22 years.
So you flew a plane?
I flew fighter jets, yes.
What kind of plane?
One of them is called a Tornado, which is basically a air-to-ground bomber, and I flew some fighters like an Alpha Jet, and I flew for the U.S. Air Force F-111s.
Wow. So when you finally started flying, was it what you hoped it would be?
Yes. Short answer is definitely yes. I had not, and this is, I think, understandable for anybody listening or watching us, the physical stress, the physical demand of flying fighter jets is a completely different level than anything you ever experience in a normal airliner, right? So that was definitely the physical fitness needed and to be maintained was very different. But we also, I mean, I can say in those 22 years, I got the really big privilege to do pretty much anything you can do with these planes because I ultimately got into test flying. I flew the plane, a little fighter jet in a group all across the Atlantic, following a tanker, and then every few minutes or like every 20, 30 minutes, go get gas and then go away and then go get gas and then go away, all the way from like Iceland to Canada in a little fighter jet. The biggest thing was not having to pee, actually, by the way, Jason. That was the biggest challenge.
Oh.
Right, because in an airliner, you can go to the restroom, but fighter jets don't have that. So,
Oh, that sounds like I mean, there's so many challenges and things that a person who's not doing the thing doesn't think of, and
right, yeah.
that'd be
Yeah, but it was also, I mean, it is kind of like the balance between some of the challenges, but it's also, and that should be the emphasis, the acceleration, like, I mean, things that we were allowed to do, that we trained for, that we got involved in. There's not very many people, and I feel very blessed that I had the opportunity to do those things.
how did you teach yourself to deal with the stress that came up and to perform at a very high level?
Well, one thing I can definitely say psychologically, shared misery is less misery. I mean, you have to keep in mind you basically grouped into so-called squadrons on a fighter base, right? And you have about 100 people, and they're all doing the same thing. And it's not that it's every day that this comes up, but like, for example, one of the times where it became came more in the forefront of the mind was when the war in Bosnia and Serbia broke out, because it became pretty clear that there was a high probability that we would participate in some way. And when that happens, it's no longer just training, but you actually getting shot at, and you could theoretically die, right? And so those are the moments where you can say, okay, everybody goes to the same thing. The other thing I would say is, and I don't think that I've ever lost that, is a constant striving for mastery. Right. I mean, there were people, and I don't want to brag because there were others in other parts of the community who did their thing. I ultimately didn't just fly, but I was also responsible for what's called electronic warfare. And some people claimed that I knew the bits and bytes by their first name in the computers of the plane. And, that's kind of what I mean when I say mastery. It's not enough to say, okay, I know where to push the power, or where to move the stick to make fly a turn. And you really, really want to know exactly what this thing can do and how it does it. I actually once got paid for a little anecdote where we brought back a plane that would have, by procedure, should have been ejected out of. And I was the instructor with the student, right? Like, so it was saved $70 million and brought a completely freaked out student back home. So. But you can do that when you really know your stuff, right? And I think that is a certain level of mastery. If you're always trying to accomplish in everything you do, then that's a good approach to have.
So I missed it. How did you save $70 million?
Well, the planes that we were flying, that was at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. That was a training version of fighter jets to train new pilots that came out of basic pilot training to learn how to fly the jets. And I don't want to make it too long of a story, but fundamentally, these jets had two engines and two what you would call electric motors / generators. I don't know if you're familiar or your audience is familiar, but basically a generator is an electric motor running in reverse, right? So when you have two of those and they are driven by the same drive shaft, you need to make sure that they are in sync, that they're synchronized with each other. So not one is fighting against the other. And what had happened is that one of those on one of the engines in the plane we were flying had shown some error. So maintenance basically exchanged it against a new one. But the one thing that they forgot is to do a software update for this synchronization. So we are flying, and suddenly first the one side, the one generator says, I'm sick, I need to be turned off. And we thought, okay, well, that can happen. There's a checklist. We went through the checklist, turned it off, and without the generator, you also then basically have to turn off the engine because it needs electricity, not just fuel. But then a minute or two later, and we were originally at low level, so we climbed up, turned off the one generator. Shortly after, the other generator on the other side suddenly said, I'm sick and I want to be turned off. Well, if you turn them both off and you have two engines, then it's hard to fly, you can imagine, right? So, and I'm like, how likely is it that both generators in one 90-minute flight could get sick and signal that they needed to be turned off? And to me, that sounded like very, very unlikely. Now, when you read the checklist, it said, a dual generator failure, there is an emergency switch that you can throw that gives you electricity for 15 minutes to take the plane to a safe area and eject. But if you throw that switch, there is no return. You are now committed to eject. And so I knew all of that, but for me, it was like, no, there's not a way in my book that this is realistic. Now, keep in mind, in the front seat was a relatively fresh student, right? Like, so for him, the world was just about to end. So I basically told him, okay, so on the left side that we just 5 minutes ago turned off, turn the engine back on, turn the generator on. He did, and it ran for like 2 minutes. Then we turned the right side off. And then the left side started complaining again, I'm sick, I need to be turned off. So to me, this indicated there's something else going on than really sick generators. And so what we ended up doing, we were about 20 minutes away from home base. I taught him basically and calmly talked him into switching one engine on and the generator on, fly for 2 minutes, light comes on, switch the other one on, and back and forth. Yeah, until basically we landed. He was probably, I mean, the way he got out of the plane, he could barely stand. He was so, sure that he would have to eject. But the 70 million was the value of the jet at the time, was about a 4-year-old plane.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and ejection is never good because the thing is obviously completely destroyed. And most of the time, especially when you have a student and they get really like anxious, there's also injuries. Right? The ejection system in and of itself is a very safe thing, but it also requires a relatively calm mind, and you need to do the process and the procedures perfectly like you did in training. But your mind sometimes doesn't allow you to be in that state, right? And so, yeah, I actually got like about $3,000 as a commendation for extra money to bringing back the jet and bringing back the student. And it was one of those stories where what I said earlier about mastery, what I basically figured out subconsciously is that this circumstance as it presented itself was not really a mechanical failure. Later on, after this all happened, and then there's a big incident report, as you can imagine, like anytime anything happens in aviation, we probably all heard this little story where like a door fell out of an airliner the other day at Alaska.
Yeah.
So when that happens, there's a huge investigation to find out. And the result of my investigation was that the maintenance crews forgot to do that synchronization. So whenever they got these two generators got out of sync, they reported, as they should, that something is wrong, right? And we were supposed to react according to the checklist. And so the checklist later got changed to say, when you get that indication, wait a minute, wait and see if the other generator, and actually check this out. And when this happens, it's not that either one of them is really sick, but probably the synchronization is missing. Right? Because if I had known this and not just gone after the checklist, I would have actually said, shut one off and we just fly with the other one. Then it wouldn't have reported any issue, right? So, yeah, so there is a checklist for that plane. I mean, it's now going to celebrate its 50th anniversary, that type of plane that I was flying. So I don't think they really have it in active duty anymore. But in the set of checklists, there's a little thing where I can say, because we brought it back, that got added into the checklist to check if maybe the maintenance guys forgot to synchronize properly.
So this was just the moment of heroism. I mean,
Uh, it didn't feel like that at all. I was just doing my job. Honestly, that's how I felt to me.
but you got the student safely on the ground.
Right,
You
right,
saved the plane. But that moment of heroism, what I'm getting at is that moment didn't come out of nowhere. You had spent years mastering
right.
this and years learning how to calm your mind. Where did your interest in mastering things start, do you think?
Um, well, one part of it is the curiosity to understand how something works, right? And it started out like, I mean, I grew up in Germany, as we said, in northern Germany, and my grandpa and grandma raised me, and he was a semi-professional bike rider, right? So he
Oh wow.
insisted that I learn everything about how a bicycle works. And then, when I got like into 14, 15 years old, all the people that I went to school with, the guys, they all wanted to get what's called a mofa, right? Like basically a little bit more than a glorified motorized bicycle.
Oh, a
But
mofa.
yeah, but see, the thing about it was the engines were basically reduced to not go faster than basically something like 20 miles an hour. But they were more powerful than that, and it was totally lame to drive around with a little like sounded like a sewing machine, And so all of us wanted to learn how can we manipulate this thing to go faster, right? And I admit for a while also how to make it more noisy. so, and then the next thing after that was a moped, which was allowed legally to go 50, about 45 miles an hour, but I got mine to about 65, right? so, so I think part of it is the curiosity, and part of it is just to say, how does this thing work, and how can I manipulate it? And it stuck with me ever since, right? So.
So that's how you got into mastery. How did you start learning to calm your mind?
Well, one thing, and I guess everybody is a little different, but what I realized is the ability to absorb and bring in a lot of complex information that is not just something that you memorize, but something where you also physically have to take action was easier for me from a calm, kind of like really focused, almost like in the zone kind of perspective. And
Mm.
it was mainly triggered in the Air Force before the reunification of Germany. There was always the assumption that there could be a war between NATO and Russia, or actually the Soviet Union at the time.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And that war could become a nuclear war. So the planes I was flying at the time had nuclear capability.
Oh,
And what
by
you
the
have,
way, oh my gosh. Okay.
yeah, yeah. So the what was known is, even though these planes had a lot of electronics, they were built in a way that you could theoretically fly them mechanically. Like there were mechanical engines, there were mechanical connections to the surfaces, so you could fly turns and stuff like that. So what we had to train for was you take off at night. There is a nuclear attack somewhere in Europe that electronic EMP blast knocks out all your electronics, but your plane is still flying and you still have the nuclear bomb under the belly. And for wherever you are, more or less blind, like in the dark of the night, just with a map
Oh,
and a stopwatch, how to hit the target that this bomb was for.
oh,
And those were 3-hour missions, 3.5 hour missions. And it was so much stuff, so many details, every turn point, the timing, and you needed to basically have this all and still fly the plane. And besides that, the point is these planes are so complex, especially when they get basically all the electronics get wiped out, that it's not realistic to assume that they would perform as they always do. So you had to have all this supplementary information completely in your memory so you could pay attention to what's actually going on. And when you are in a nervous, I don't know how else to say, kind of nervous, like unfocused state of mind, I believe, at least for myself, I'm not saying everybody is the same, but for me, I can't imagine that I could have absorbed it and actually, because we ultimately trained this, right? Not with knocking out the electronics, but we turned off systems on the plane and said, let's fly this mission as if it were real. And basically you had nothing than the map and the stopwatch and see if you could have actually made the target, right? And I learned for myself to absorb it initially, to even have it like available in my memory, in my mind. I needed to do this in a basically calm and collected way. And you know, that helps, because then you have this, I believe what this builds is the capacity for a very quick reaction. And I don't say this to brag, but there were some situations just in driving cars where something happened very rapidly, and I had a passenger in the car and I reacted almost instinctively and avoided an accident. And people that were there, experienced it with me, said, I don't even know how you did this so fast.
Wow.
Right? Like from the moment to see something, to take the physical action to avoid some collision or something like that. And like I said, I can't really necessarily explain exactly how the brain or the body does it, but I believe it has something to do with how you bring information in. And the other thing that flying obviously does in my life and everybody that I know in that profession, we were flying anywhere between 8 and 10 miles per minute, right? So if you think about that, you have to look ahead and anticipate what's happening, right? Like that's a really, really quick pace and a really like far distance in a short period of time. And so for anything that I've ever done during and after, my whole body system, my eyes, my brain, everything is always kind of looking ahead and anticipating, and that has helped me many times.
So Axel, this is fascinating. Now you're in a completely different topography, a completely I'm trying to think of how to bridge it with a metaphor, but basically the geography of real estate is completely different than the physical geography of flying. But how did the skills you learned in the Air Force, and how do those skills translate into what you're doing now?
Well, there are a couple of things. One thing I mentioned was that little incident of bringing back the plane with the student in the front seat, right? In a sense,
I don't think you'll ever be able to call the incident little. There's nothing little about the incident.
Okay, but all right, I give you that one. The thing about it is still, I was in the role of an instructor helping and teaching a student. Now, the circumstance was extreme, admittedly, but that was the scenario, and that was my role. I was stationed there to run a project and instruct new students. And if you think about what I'm doing at Idea Westbrower is I'm inviting people who want to build a passive income portfolio using real estate, how they can do that so that they ultimately reach a milestone in their life where they can say, I bring in enough money from my investment so I have the freedom to decide what I want to do with my time. And that is, I don't call it training or teaching or stuff. I call it mentoring, and it really is more mentoring than just a pure act of teaching. But there is, for example, a strong comparability, because all the things that I learn, and you have to keep in mind, it's not like kids in school, it's like adults, right? Just like they were adults in the Air Force that I trained, the people that I'm working with in Idea Westbrower are adults. The thing that is very different but still fascinating to me is the assets that we are actually getting, because the houses that I and our clients invest in become homes for the tenants that live in those houses, right? And so that is a component and an aspect, that goes fundamentally, and I don't want to get too philosophical, but there is an idea called the Maslow's pyramid of needs.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
the very fundamental level for human beings in that pyramid of needs, where the very top is self-fulfillment, but the very bottom, the foundation says you need food, shelter, and security,
Mm.
right? And so I did 22 years of security, if you think about it, and now I'm working on shelter, right? And so that's really a very fundamental thing to say, okay, how can I help others, and doing it myself, to provide shelter to people that want to fulfill themselves.
So a real estate investor in residential isn't just investing to
Yeah,
make money. That's something that happens, but they also literally are providing shelter to
right.
people who need shelter.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is, I have found in many, many things that they end up being in some way, shape, or form a form of a scale, which has two sides or sometimes four sides to it, right? So the investing, if you only look at maximizing profit, then you would probably try to buy something where you can expect that the value of that house or apartment is going to go up rapidly. If you, on the other hand, say, I'm investing in these houses, number one, for performance, so they pay me something every month, but number two, because I'm building a portfolio for myself and my family and the next generation, where I and my family can ultimately live off the income. But like in my case, my daughter and our grandson can most likely continue to live off that, right? So the profit intention is one way to invest. But the longer term, supporting your life based on your investments, in my view, is the much bigger picture and the much more aligned thing that I'm involved in. And a lot of people, there's also a little bit of like helping people to realize that investing in residential real estate is not just something for rich people. I mean, I didn't get born rich. My grandpa showed me how to fix a bicycle because he was too cheap to buy a new one, right? So, and then everything after that. So I believe, and people underestimate it. Right now we have well-performing properties that start at $15,000 down payment, right, for an investor. It's not that you have to have hundreds of thousands or that you buy these properties in cash or anything like that, right? And so you can step by step build a portfolio, and ultimately, the longer you have it, the more it's going to perform and the more it's going to pay you.
For a beginning real estate investor, what say they have the money they would need to invest, but what are some of the biggest mental hurdles that they have to surmount to actually say, yes, I'm going to invest, I'm going to try this?
Well, I found there are two kinds of people to answer that question. The one kind is the kind of people who hear about somebody else having success with something, whether it's investing in Bitcoin or in gold or in stocks or in real estate or whatever it may be. And they believe, oh, it can't be that hard, I just try it. And then it's basically somebody that I like who always says, hope is not a strategy. Well, that's what they're basically putting their investment decision on. The other kind of people, and this is the answer to your question from my perspective, are people who are a little bit more focused, and they look at what are my options out there and then make a judgment call. What do I believe I can reasonably accomplish? And so the biggest thing to overcome is when you start looking into real estate investing, it can rather quickly become relatively complex. It's not complicated, but it's relatively complex. And so the hurdle to overcome is, rather than being basically hampered and held back by that complexity, is to find somebody, and that's why I'm offering the mentoring, to find somebody who has done it. I have done probably 15 or 20 or 30 deals by now, not just myself, but for our clients as well, probably more actually. And you learn with every single one, right? So instead of saying, okay, I start from scratch when somebody like Axel has done it for 15 years now, that's a big hurdle to overcome, to be willing to say, I want to do it with and under the tutelage of someone, and you can call that mentoring. That gives the highest likelihood of success, because you can do what took me 10 years to learn in 6 months, because I can obviously help you avoid all the pitfalls and all the things that could go wrong.
What's the difference to you between the words complex and complicated?
Right. Complex is basically a lot of different things are influencing the outcome, right? And so, I mean, if you say, okay, if I go to the casino and I want to have a 50-50 chance, forget about the zero, just most cases. 50-50 chance you put your money on black or on red, right? So that would be very simple. And anything that is more complex would be like a house where you need a lender and insurance, and you need an inspection and an appraiser and a bank and the right property and a good tenant and somebody to manage. And you can see how many different things ultimately influence success. But it's not complicated, because ultimately what we want to do is we want to change ownership from a house that exists or a new one, from the current owner to us, and have somebody who knows what they're doing put a tenant in who dependently pays. Now, yet go to the other extreme of my life and say, okay, let's just for a moment imagine what happens when you open the doors on a fighter jet and look inside. Or even go on YouTube and look at any of the cockpits inside. That's complicated. That is just on a completely different level, right? So it's also complex, but it's complex and complicated, while, as I would say, real estate investing is a relatively easy transaction. So in that sense, it's not complicated. It just has a lot of influencing people and pieces, and that makes it complex.
What do you say to prospective investors about taking a risk? Of course, with any investment, there's a chance of it going up and a chance going down.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is having that statement and that mindset and that thought is probably heavily influenced by what the media is telling us. And what I mean by that is, most of the time when somebody says, let me talk about or think about the topic of investing, they say, I spend money on something with the assumption that it increases in value. And that's pretty much what we assume investing to be, right? And if it does, then we make a profit. And if it doesn't, then we have a loss. Real estate investing specifically, but in general investing, I would say, compared to gambling, for example, is more than that. Because when you take this example of a house, like you came to me, Jason, you would say, Axel, we have been talking about it, we know each other forever, I want to finally buy one of these houses. And how can I find one that is worth investing in? Then I would say, well, we want to look at performance and not just purely at the ability to gain value. When you ask yourself, you see this in the background here on our video, there's the word ideal, right? There is a reason why I call it ideal wealth grower. And ideal is not just a good word, it's also an abbreviation. So when we look at this house now that you might be interested, or anybody listening to us is interested, the I stands for how much income is it going to make for us? Income, not value income. Then D stands for what is the government allowing us to do with the so-called depreciation, meaning like a tax benefit, Then the E stands for equity. That is actually when the tenants pay you rent and you use the rent to pay off the mortgage, the loan that you got to buy the house, then the lower the loan amount balance is versus the value of the house is the equity that is in the house. Right? And you have probably seen in the news lately that a lot of people say when you're living in a house for a while, you can actually borrow against that equity. Then the A stands for appreciation. That's the traditional thing that people think about investing. Is I bought it for $100,000, now it's $120,000, now I have $20,000 appreciation. And then the L stands for leverage, which is also a huge differentiator. If you want to buy a stock, any company, IBM or Google, Apple, whatever, and you want to buy $100 stock and you have $1,000, then you get 10. If you want to at the same time say I buy $100,000 house, you don't have to put $100,000 on the table. All you need to do is 20,000. Leverage means the bank is giving you 4/5 and you put in 1/5. The trick why is leverage so cool and interesting is because even though they pay 80% and you pay 20%, you're allowed to keep 100% of the profit. So just to make that a really finer point here, if you buy a $100,000 house and it increases by 5%, I don't think that is like outrageous, right? So it basically increased by $5,000 in value. But you put $20,000 in and the bank put $80,000 in. So for you, $20,000 that you put in, 5% is 20% of gain. Not 5%. 5% is on the total value of the house, but for your money, you made 20%. And that is before any of the other things. No tax benefit, no equity, no nothing. It's just that, right? So the answer is basically we look at investing because we are influenced by the media, as I said a little earlier, as I buy something for a price and I hope it goes up. Real estate, especially residential real estate, is very different because it has 5 different ways of how to generate income. And when you add them all together, it's not that unusual that a real estate investor makes 30 or 40% on their $20,000 investment. Right? So it's just nobody thinks about it that way. And that's also where we come back to, it's not hard or complicated, it's complex. It has all these components to consider. But I mean, if you were to say, I gamble on the stock market and hope I make 20 or 30% gain, or I can buy a house forever and make 30% gain, it's a no-brainer.
I've never thought about it. So the bank doesn't loan out money to buy stocks.
No, you have to put up 100%. If you want $100,000 in Google, Apple, or whatever, you have to put 100,000 on the table, or give it to your broker. That also means, by the way, Jason, if you think about it, if I have $100,000 for you came to me, then you can buy $100,000 worth of stock or $500,000 worth of real estate.
Wow. Well, this is really an interesting stuff, actually, and you're saying that someone doesn't need $1 million or $10 million to participate.
Right, exactly. Well, keep in mind, if you were to go on this journey with me, or any of your listeners were to go on this journey with me, and they have a certain amount of money they can start investing with. And I think it's fair and important to say, if you're not ready to invest, then stay away from investing, right? So ready means, in my case, something between $15,000, $20,000 is what you should have accumulated. But for people who do this and want to actually make it work for them, they have probably also some habits where they put a certain amount of money aside every month. Right. So if you now go and say, okay, if each house, and I know they're not all exactly the same, but if each house would cost you $12,000 down payment, and you might say this is crazy, but I have literally, I just right now we're we're buying 2 properties, one for a client, one that I'm buying, we're paying $13,000 down. So it's not completely unrealistic or something like that. But what that also means is I would help you, teach you, take you under my wings to do that first investment. And all I would say is keep putting those $1,000 a month that you put down anyway or put aside in your savings account. Just keep doing this. And next year you have another 12,000 and we buy the second one. And the next year you have another 12,000, you buy the second one. And by the way, as soon as you bought the first one and it starts paying you a little bit of income, and you're not going to get rich on that one house. It might pay you $250 a month, but that adds to your money that you put aside too. So in the first year you put maybe 12,000. In the second year you put 15,000. In the third year you put maybe 18,000 or 20,000. Right, so you can see that the accumulation of properties accelerates the longer you're doing it, but you don't have to change any of your habits. You just keep putting the same amount of money aside from your traditional income plus whatever your investments generate. And rather quickly, you end up somewhere with 7, 8, 9, 10 houses. And most people, when they get to somewhere around 8, the amount of money that comes in is already at a point where they start thinking, maybe I can cut back to half time or maybe even quit my job.
Along with that, please talk about the importance of the time freedom point.
Well, the importance is, and I call it a milestone because one thing, that I have learned through the military, we talked a little bit about that psychological aspect, is to kind of step back, take a big picture view and say, okay, what do I want to accomplish in life? And I always ask people who say, I would be interested to potentially work with you to say, let's address that part first. What do you want to accomplish in life? How long, for example, do you really want to live and work in this normal traditional system of having a job? So most people say, well, I don't want to necessarily live the life that my parents had and work till 65 or 68 or something like that. At least not where I'm dependent on the job. So if we take that as a basis, then the question becomes, if you were to quit your job today, how much money does it actually take per month to cover everything that you do in your life? Like pay your rent or pay your mortgage and have a car and go on vacation and buy gifts for Christmas and for birthdays and stuff. What is that number? Right? And so let's just, for the sake of argument, say that number were $4,000 a month. Right? So then I can say, okay, if we have houses that we buy that pay us $500 each per month, we need 8. If they pay us $400, we need 10. If they pay us something like $300, we need 11 or so, right, on first glance. So that tells us what's our goal? Where do we need to get to? And what typically happens is the 4,000 that you need right now in 6, 7, 8, 9 years, when you have bought these houses that you actually need, you probably need 5,000. But these houses will also pay you more because nobody is such a great landlord that you never increase the rent. Right? If it's on the first day paying you $250, in 6 or 7 years, it's probably going to pay you $350 or $400. Long story short, the point is when you can say, my time horizon is in 8 years, in 10 years, in 12 years, I want to have the freedom to decide, do I still want to go to work? Or do I want to do things where the fact whether it makes money or not is irrelevant? Right? If you and I say we want to start a band, and it's probably not going to be the greatest band, especially because I play 0 instrument and I have 2 left hands and all thumbs. So it's not going to be a great band. But if we're passionate and we want to have a band, like the Jason and Axel do, right? It doesn't matter if we have a source of income that covers everything that we need for life, for our family, for our kids, for everything. We can have a band and go out gigging and even do it for free all day long. That's what time freedom actually affords you, is to say, I have the freedom to use my time however I want, because I no longer have to make sure that I have enough money to cover the expenses of my life.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. One obvious question that I forgot to ask, do Do your clients manage their houses? Like, are they property managers too, or do they pay someone to do that?
Yeah, that what we do and what we have found is when your focus is on the investment to perform as well as possible, then the likelihood that that is around the corner where you live is very low. Very few people are lucky. I have to say, in our community of clients, we haven't had anybody who happens to live right next to the best investing area. So I call this, you probably have to invest out of state or at least so far away from where the investment is that it's not useful to drive there yourself. So what we do is we buying properties from so-called turnkey providers, right? So those are companies who make their business in finding what I call the ugly duckling in a good neighborhood. They buy it for cheap, they renovate it, put it on the market and say, hey, I have a fully renovated house, perfect suited for rent. And then the bank sends an appraiser and says, let's see if this is really as much worth as you want for it. So obviously, we're always trying to find that balance. And there's the word balance or scale again, right? Between what they ask for and what the appraiser says. So we want to have a match there. Then we buy the house with 80% from the bank, 20% our own money. And that same company that found it and renovated and sold it to us is the same company who's now going to manage it for us, which is also important because I believe if that's known from day one, they will probably renovate it a little better. And we have actually organizations we work with who give us 2 years of free property management at the day of purchase, because they are so confident that they don't have really anything to do other than putting a tenant in and collect the money, that they don't even want to get paid for 2 years.
Have you seen most of the houses you own, or in person? Do you go
Yeah,
to them?
I'd say about 80% I visited myself, yes. And I could have not taken my wife because they were oftentimes ripped half apart, and she would have had a heart attack if she had seen them before they were finished.
So we're getting towards the end here of the hour. Which is too bad because this is such a great conversation. But I asked all my guests, what does the phrase imperfect best? I talk about doing our imperfect best, and what it means to me is when I do my imperfect best, I envision the best I want and go towards it, and as I go towards it, mistakes happen sometimes, and challenges come up, but instead of quitting, I learn from those mistakes and challenges and move forward. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you, Axel?
Well, it basically means to convince as many people as possible to trust me and allow me to help them so that they can get that time freedom that I have accomplished. And I look at it as, if somebody says, I don't know if it's possible, then I can say, well, at least I'm one living example that it's possible because I've done it and I can prove it. Right. And I always say, I don't want to convince anybody to do anything that I haven't already done or am currently doing. Right. And so that's basically my imperfect best, is to improve myself, find better deals, better providers, better insurance, better banks and stuff. And there is no real perfect in that context, but a little bit more perfect or better perfect or whatever word you want to use. So that not just, I keep investing just like my clients invest. So we're doing the same thing, just at different stages on the journey. And so that's really what I'm looking for, is, finding more opportunities and convincing more people to join me.
Well said. Thank you. Is is your website the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, one is they can go to idealwealthgrower.com, or if they want to hear Jason, then they can go to the Ideal Investor Show and listen to the episode that we're going to have with you.
Yeah, true. It was really fun when you interviewed me. Like, I was taking notes on as an interviewee, I was taking notes on what you were saying. It was amazing.
Yeah, I loved it too. So that's why I'm here, right? Like we really we vibe together somehow.
We do. This has been fun, and I love knowing more of the stories of your amazing life and how you've chosen to focus your energy on moving from where you were as a kid to where you are now is really inspiring. And it sounds like a lot of work along the way. Thanks for being you and thanks for all the people you help.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoy. Thank you for having me. And maybe we should start a podcast about Axel's stories from the Air Force time or something. We could
Oh,
do probably
wow.
100
I,
episodes just for that.
wow, I bet you have so many.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
So, oh gosh. So we meet a lot of people in our lives, leads in certain occupations, and as a speaker, I'm constantly networking and meeting new people, and it's just so easy to. I find it so easy to think I who know who a person is and to know the basic stories and stuff. But I realized from this interview, like Axel has so many stories that, and we just saw the tip of the iceberg. So I encourage you, as I often encourage you, to ask the people around you new questions. Ask about their childhood. Ask about the different jobs they've had, the different careers. Ask about their family. Ask stories go on and on. Let's learn about each other and celebrate each other instead of thinking we know each other and being bored. Anyway, that's my pep talk for today. Um, Thanks for tuning in. Tune in for another episode of Awkwardly Awesome next week where I interview another great guest. And if you have any comments, of course, please share them and thank you. And thanks most of all for watching. And I just noticed the shelves are coming through the center of my head. I should do that better next time. Oh well. You do these and you learn. Talk to you later. Bye.